Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat? The voice was crisp and professional, but edged with barely hidden impatience. Robert Mitchell, 84 years old, didn't turn his head from the small oval window. Below, the tarmac shimmered in the midday sun, a sprawling concrete world of baggage carts and fuel trucks. He had seen 1,000 runways just like it. Some had welcomed him home with cheers, others with the silence of a mission completed in the dead of night. This one just felt noisy. Sir, the flight attendant, whose name tag read Lisa, tried again, her voice a little louder this time. This is business class. I need to see your boarding pass. A man in the seat across the aisle, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Robert's first car, let out an audible sigh. He flicked an imaginary piece of lint from his creased trousers and shot a pointed look at Lisa, an unspoken command to resolve the situation quickly. Robert finally turned, his movement slow and deliberate. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a calm depth that seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the cabin around him. He looked at the young woman with the perfectly applied makeup and the tight bun of blonde hair, and offered a small, polite nod. Seat 16A, he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. That's what the ticket says. Lisa's smile was a thin, painted line. I understand, sir, but sometimes there are mix-ups. Perhaps you'd let me just double-check it for you. The man in the suit, David, couldn't contain himself any longer. For goodness sake, just check the ticket so we can get on our way. Some of us have meetings to get to that actually matter. He said it to Lisa, but his dismissive gaze was fixed on Robert's simple tweed jacket and worn corduroy trousers. He looked into David's critical eye, like a man who had wandered out of a thrift store and onto the wrong airplane. Robert's hands, rough with age and speckled with liver spots, reached into his jacket pocket. They were steady, rock steady. He pulled out a creased paper boarding pass and held it out. Lisa took it from him, holding it by the very edges as if it might be contaminated. She scanned it, her expression flickering from condescension to confusion, and then back to a more fortified version of condescension. The pass was legitimate. Seat 16A, Robert Mitchell. Well, she said, handing it back with a huff, everything appears to be in order. The subtext was clear. She didn't understand how, but the paperwork was unfortunately correct. Please place your carry-on fully under the seat in front of you, sir. We'll be closing the cabin doors shortly. Robert gave another quiet nod and turned back to his window. He didn't have a carry-on to put away. Everything he needed was in the pockets of his jacket. David scoffed loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Unbelievable. They let anyone up here these days. Probably used his life savings on the ticket. Lisa shot David a look that was part appeasement, part shared frustration, before continuing her pre-flight duties. The confrontation seemed over, but the air in the front of the cabin remained thick with a sour, unspoken judgment. Robert didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the ground crew, their movements a familiar ballet of precision and purpose. The situation, however, was far from resolved. Lisa, encouraged by the support of the passenger in 17B, decided to press the issue. She returned with the lead flight attendant, a severe-looking woman named Susan. This is the gentleman, Susan, Lisa said, gesturing toward Robert. I verified his ticket, but, well, she trailed off, letting Susan's eyes do the work. Susan's gaze swept over Robert, taking in the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, and the quiet stillness of the old man. Her lips tightened. Sir, Susan began, her voice dripping with authority. We've had a complaint from another passenger about a potential seating issue. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you a few questions. Are you feeling all right today? Do you know where you're headed? The condescension was now obvious, painting Robert as a confused senior who had somehow stumbled into a world where he didn't belong. He looked up at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than patience crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, bone-deep weariness. I'm feeling fine, thank you, Robert said, his voice steady, and I'm headed to San Diego. My ticket, as your colleague saw, confirms that. David chimed in again, his voice oozing with false concern. Look, maybe the old-timer's confused. It happens. My grandfather gets lost in his own house. Just move him to the back of the plane. We'll all be happier. A few other passengers murmured in agreement, the desire to get airborne overriding any sense of decency. They saw an obstacle, a delay personified in an old man in a cheap jacket. They didn't see the man. The pressure was mounting. Susan, the lead attendant, crossed her arms. Sir, your ticket may be valid, but airline policy gives us the right to reseat or remove any passenger who may be a source of disturbance. Several passengers are now disturbed. Robert's hand rested on his lap, fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of a worn leather wristband on his other arm. It was a simple, plain strip of dark brown leather, cracked with age, the kind of thing a teenager might wear. David noticed it, a sneer twisting his lips. What's that thing on his wrist? Probably hasn't taken it off in 50 years. Is that even sanitary? The comment hung in the air, a piece of casual cruelty designed to strip away the last of the old man's dignity. The wristband. It was just a piece of leather. But to Robert, it was a lifeline to another world, another time. The sterile, climate-controlled air of the cabin dissolved. For a split second, the scent of recycled air was replaced by the sharp smell of jet fuel and scorched earth. The gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit became the deafening roar of an F-4 Phantom screaming down a runway in Da Nang. A young man with bright, confident eyes and a reckless grin, Tommy Dagger Wilson, was leaning against the cockpit, strapping an identical leather band onto a younger Robert's wrist. Tommy's own was already in place. One for the road, Shadow, he'd said, his voice nearly lost in the engine noise. So you remember which way is up. Brings you home. The memory was a flash, a physical jolt as sharp and sudden as an ejection. It was over in a heartbeat, leaving Robert back in the plush leather of seat 16A, the weight of the years settling back onto his shoulders. He looked down at the bracelet. Tommy never made it home. The captain's arrival was the final act of this humiliating play. Summoned by Susan, Captain Reynolds strode down the aisle, his crisp white shirt and gold epaulets radiating an aura of ultimate authority. He was young with a serious, no-nonsense face. He listened with a grim expression as Susan and Lisa explained the situation, their words painting Robert as a confused, possibly disruptive elderly passenger. David added his own 2 cents about the delay and the comfort of his fellow premium passengers. A few rows back, a young man named Chris had been watching the entire scene with a knot tightening in his stomach. He was an aviation enthusiast on his way to an air show. There was something about the old man, his posture, the unsettling calm in his eyes, the way he met every insult with quiet dignity, that didn't add up. It wasn't confusion, it was control. An immense, unshakable control that Chris had only ever read about in books about test pilots and astronauts. The captain was now standing over the old man. Sir, I'm Captain Reynolds. It seems we have a problem. This was it. They were going to throw him off the plane. Chris knew he had to do something. He pulled out his phone. The cabin doors were still open. He had a minute, maybe 2. He sent a frantic text to his friend Mark, an air traffic controller at the regional command center. Mark, you're not going to believe this. I'm on flight 732 at JFK, gate C26. There's this old guy, maybe in his 80s, in business class. The crew and some jerk are giving him hell, trying to kick him off. Something is not right about it. His name is Robert Mitchell, Mitchell. He just sits there taking it. Can you do me a favor and just see if that name means anything? Fast, he hit send, his heart pounding. Up front, Captain Reynolds was leaning in, his voice low but firm. Sir, I need you to be reasonable. We have a flight to run. Robert looked up at the captain, then at the flight attendants, at the sneering face of David, and at the curious or annoyed faces of the passengers around him. He gave a slow, tired sigh and reached for his seatbelt buckle. The fight, it seemed, was over. At the New York TRACON facility in Long Island, air traffic controller Mark Davis glanced at the text from his friend Chris and rolled his eyes. A passenger dispute. Still, Chris wasn't one for drama. On a whim during a lull in traffic, he typed the name Robert Mitchell into the integrated FAA and Federal Personnel database. The search returned dozens of results. Robert Mitchell, a dentist from Poughkeepsie. Robert Mitchell, a retired postal worker in Queens. Nothing. He was about to text Chris back with a shrug when another message came through. He's got this old leather wristband. They're mocking him for it. He keeps touching it, and I think I heard him mutter a word. Shadow or something. Sounded like a name. Shadow. That was different. Mark added the word to the search query. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the system blinked. A single file appeared on his screen, flagged with a deep crimson color and a seal he had only ever seen in training manuals. The file was designated Eyes Only, Level 7 Clearance. Mark felt a cold chill run down his spine. His supervisor, a stern former Air Force colonel named Harrison, was walking by. He noticed the color on Mark's screen and stopped dead. "What is that, Davis?" I don't know, sir," Mark stammered. "A friend on Flight 732 at JFK asked me to run a name. Robert Mitchell." It cross-referenced with his call sign. Harrison leaned over, his eyes scanning the screen. His face went pale. He stood bolt upright, a look of utter disbelief on his face. "Get me the tower supervisor at Kennedy. Now," he snapped, his voice a low, urgent command. "And get me a direct patch to the cockpit of Flight 732. Use the Shadow 1 frequency. Tell them to hold that aircraft at the gate. I don't care if they have to fake a mechanical issue. That plane does not move." Back on Flight 732, Robert Mitchell had just unbuckled his seatbelt. The click echoed in the tense silence of the cabin. He placed his hands on the armrests, preparing to push his old body up and out of the seat. He would leave. He wouldn't make a scene. He had endured far worse than the petty humiliations of a flight attendant and a pompous businessman. Captain Reynolds nodded, a flicker of relief on his face. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. We will have someone meet you at the gate to discuss other arrangements." David leaned back in his seat with a triumphant smirk, crossing his arms. "Finally," he muttered, "some order." Lisa looked smugly at Susan, a small, vindicated smile playing on her lips. They had won. They had protected the sanctity of business class. Just as Robert began to rise, the cockpit door flew open. The first officer stood there, his face ashen, holding the radio headset. "Captain," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you need to take this now. It's NORAD." Captain Reynolds froze. NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command. That was impossible. "Are you serious, Tom?" "They're on a priority military channel, sir. They're demanding to speak with the captain of this aircraft. He said to tell you the call is regarding Shadow." The name again. Reynolds shot a confused look at Robert, who had settled back into his seat, his expression unreadable. A sense of profound unease began to creep into the cabin. This was no longer a simple passenger dispute. Reynolds hurried into the cockpit, pulling the door shut behind him. The cabin waited in a suspended, anxious silence. Passengers whispered to each other, their annoyance replaced by nervous curiosity. What in the world was going on? David's smirk had vanished, replaced by a frown of confusion. Lisa and Susan exchanged worried glances. After what felt like an eternity, the cockpit door opened again. Captain Reynolds emerged. But he was a different man. His professional, detached demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was pale, his posture ramrod straight, as if he were standing before a king. He didn't look at the flight attendants or the other passengers. His eyes were locked on one person only. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps seeming to boom in the silent cabin. He stopped directly in front of seat 16A. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Then in a clear, ringing voice that carried through the entire aircraft, he said, "Colonel Mitchell, sir, on behalf of my entire crew, I offer you my deepest, most sincere apology. There has been a terrible, unforgivable mistake." He then turned, picked up the intercom handset, and flicked it on. His voice, now trembling with a mixture of shame and reverence, filled the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We would like to apologize for our departure delay. It was caused by a failure on our part, a failure to recognize the presence of a true American hero who is flying with us today." A confused murmur rippled through the cabin. The captain's voice grew stronger. "Seated among us in seat 16A is a man who has served this country with a level of valor that few can comprehend. Please allow me to introduce you to retired Air Force Colonel Robert Mitchell, a man who flew 250 combat missions, a recipient of the Air Force Cross, the Silver Star, a dozen distinguished flying crosses, and the Purple Heart. A man known to his allies and deeply feared by his enemies by a single name. The captain took a deep breath. His call sign was Shadow. The name dropped into the cabin like a thunderclap. Chris, the young man in the back, gasped. He knew that name. Every aviation buff knew it. It was a legend, a ghost story whispered by pilots. Shadow, the pilot who flew missions no one else would take, who went into the darkest of nights and came back with ghosts. As if on cue, a low, powerful roar began to build outside the aircraft. It was a sound unlike any commercial jet engine, a deep, guttural thunder that vibrated through the very frame of the plane. Passengers on the left side of the aircraft gasped and pointed. Captain Reynolds gestured toward the windows. "And as a small token of the respect he is owed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we have just been informed that we will have a special escort for the first leg of our journey." The plane began to slowly taxi away from the gate, and there, just off their left wing, pulling into a perfect, impossibly close formation, was a machine of breathtaking power and menace. An F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced fighter jet in the world, its geometric gray skin seeming to drink the sunlight. A moment later, its twin appeared off the right wing, flanking them in a display of awesome aerial might. Passengers scrambled for their phones, pressing their faces against the glass. The cabin, which moments before had been a theater of petty judgment, was now filled with gasps of wonder. In the cockpit of the F-35 on Robert's side, the pilot, a dark silhouette behind his visor, turned his head. He slowly, deliberately raised a gloved hand to his helmet in a crisp salute. Then a new voice crackled over the cabin's intercom, patched through directly from the fighter jet. It was young, clear, and filled with profound respect. "An absolute honor to be your wingman today, Shadow. The skies are yours, sir." The cabin erupted. The tension broke in a wave of spontaneous, thunderous applause. Passengers were on their feet, clapping, cheering, their phones held high to capture the incredible sight. David sat frozen in his seat, his face a ghastly shade of white, his jaw hanging open. He looked as if he might be sick. Lisa, the flight attendant, leaned against a bulkhead, her face buried in her hands, shaking with shame. Through it all, Robert Mitchell simply sat, looking out his window at the young pilot in the F-35. He watched the sleek fighter hold its position with effortless grace, a symbol of a legacy he had helped to build. A single tear, the first he had shed in decades, traced a slow path through the weathered lines of his face. He raised a slightly trembling hand and gave the pilot a slow, small nod of acknowledgement. After the plane reached cruising altitude and the F-35s had peeled off with a final magnificent wing waggle, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. The applause had died down, replaced by quiet whispers. Passengers kept glancing at seat 16A, looking at the quiet old man as if he were a living monument. Captain Reynolds made his way back down the aisle. He paused where Lisa and David were sitting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, precise, and colder than the air outside the cockpit window. To Lisa, he said, "Your conduct was a disgrace to this airline and your uniform. We will be having a formal review upon landing." He then turned his steely gaze to David. "And to you, sir, your behavior was despicable. You judged a man by his clothes and in doing so revealed a complete lack of character. I suggest you spend the rest of this flight reflecting on that." David shrank into his expensive seat, unable to meet anyone's eye. The public humiliation was absolute. Finally, the captain approached Robert's seat and knelt, bringing himself eye level with the old hero. "Colonel, I don't know how to apologize enough for what happened." Robert looked away from the clouds and met the young captain's gaze. His pale blue eyes were gentle, holding no trace of anger. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "People see an old man, and that's all they see. They forget that old men were once young. They forget what those men did, what they saw." He gestured out the window toward the empty sky where the jets had been. "That uniform you wear and the one that young man was wearing, they're about service. They mean you serve the people inside this plane. All of them, not just the ones in expensive suits. You remember that. The lesson was delivered not as a rebuke, but as a piece of quiet, hard-earned wisdom. Robert's gaze drifted down to the worn leather band on his wrist. The image of Tommy Wilson, young and full of life, flashed in his mind again. But this time the memory was longer, more painful. It wasn't the airfield at Da Nang. It was a ditch beside a burning heap of metal that used to be a plane. Robert was pulling Tommy from the wreckage, the heat searing his own skin. Tommy was dying, his breathing shallow. With his last ounce of strength, he had pulled the leather band from his own wrist and pressed it into Robert's hand. "Wear it for both of us, Shadow," he had whispered, his eyes full of the sky he would never fly in again. "Bring us home." The story of Flight 732 went viral before the plane even landed in San Diego. The videos of the F-35 escort, the captain's speech, and the mortified faces of Lisa and David were everywhere. The airline, caught in a public relations firestorm, issued a formal apology to Colonel Mitchell and announced a mandatory new training program for all staff, developed with a veterans advocacy group, focusing on dignity and respect for all passengers, especially the elderly and former service members. David's company, whose logo was visible on his briefcase in several clips, released a statement condemning his behavior and placing him on indefinite leave. Weeks later, Robert was in his usual booth at a small diner near his home, a quiet place where he could read the paper and watch the world go by. A woman approached his table, her steps hesitant. It was Lisa, the flight attendant. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, and her face was free of the professional makeup she had worn on the plane. She looked younger and deeply tired. "Colonel Mitchell," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to apologize in person. What I did, there's no excuse for it. I was wrong." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm in the new training program. I'm listening. I'm trying to learn." Robert looked up from his newspaper and gestured to the empty seat opposite him. "Sit down," he said gently. She did. He didn't lecture her. He didn't scold her. Instead, he told her a story. He told her about a young pilot named Tommy Dagger Wilson and a promise made in the smoke and fire of a long-forgotten war. He told her about the leather bracelet. He shared a piece of his pain, not to wound her, but to help her understand that every person carries a history, a story that deserves respect. When he finished, she was crying silently. He simply pushed the napkin holder toward her. "Forgiveness is the first step," he said, "for you and for me." After she left, a weight lifted from her shoulders. Robert turned his gaze back to the window. He sipped his coffee, the diner quiet around him. High above, a commercial jetliner carved a thin white line across the deep blue canvas of the sky. He watched it until it was just a tiny silver glint in the distance. And Robert Mitchell, the man they called Shadow, smiled. The quiet heroes walk among us every day. If you were moved by Colonel Mitchell's story, please hit the like button, share this video to honor all our veterans, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and character.